Welcome to the CG Pro podcast. This is episode 64, and today we have a wonderful human being joining us, Mr. Jim Ryder, who I will introduce briefly, and then we'll move over into having a good conversation. And if you enjoy what you hear today, you can follow us at becomecgpro.com or in our Facebook group. I'll have a couple of extra announcements at the end, but yeah, let's get going. So Jim is has had a very varied and wonderful career. He's a Visual Effects Supervisor, Virtual Production Supervisor. He's been in visual effects since the early days and seen it go through many transitions, having worked on some really cool things like Titanic and Star Trek and some things that you'll all know pretty well, and has been a real enthusiast and pioneer in the virtual production years, the last kind of 5 years of that movement, if you like. So yeah, Jim, great pleasure having you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here. Happy to have a chat.
Me too.
Yeah.
Cup of tea and a chat.
Exactly.
So, yeah, tell me a little bit about the early days. How did you get into visual effects? I know that you started off on some early visual effects movies and some of the pioneering companies working on things like Titanic and that kind of thing. Was film something you always wanted to get into? Did you study for it? Like, how did that go?
Well, I'm just reaching back into the history, but I was always interested in filmmaking ever since I was a kid. That's sort of the background there. Whenever they would have the behind the scenes or making of documentaries about various shows or whatever, I was always really interested in the craft of filmmaking and how it was done. That said, I was not pursuing that when I went to college, and I was actually a computer science major for a number of years until I decided that wasn't for me as a career.
Me too.
But yeah, by the way, if you're anybody that's in college, if you look at other people who are studying what you're studying and you look at them and they're having a really good time and they're really into it and you're less into it, then you should probably pick another major, which is exactly, I was like, I don't know if I want to do this for a living, but gave me a great foundation and all sorts of things. But when I was there was a small AV department in my college, and I remember they had an Arri S 16 millimeter camera, and a friend of mine who I went to school with were like, how do we get our hands on that thing? So we can No, I was just saying, when I was in school, I availed myself of all the various AV gear that could be done. And some friends of mine made a short film when I was...
Welcome to live broadcast, everybody. We're experiencing a little bit of a technical glitch, but hopefully we'll be back to you in any second. I guess we lost Jim for a second. So welcome to the CG Pro podcast, where it's just me. Maybe I should interview myself. So Ed, how did you get into film in the first place? Well, Ed, I will. I won't do that for you. Maybe one day we'll get someone on here to interview me. But in the meantime, I can tell you a little bit about some things we have coming up at CG Pro whilst we wait. So obviously, as a school, we run classes, and we have open days now once a month. So if you're interested in jumping in to an open day, we can direct you towards a page on our website that has some of the events listed on our website. Open days are available to everybody. You can come in and check us out as a school. We have some cool classes coming up, and I think Jim's coming back in here, so I'll bring him in just 2 seconds. But check out the website. We have some cool courses coming up in a lot of Unreal disciplines like characters. We have a blueprints class coming up, a Perforce workshop, which is everybody's favorite. But come and check out an open day. Check out our website if you're interested in what we're doing in the school. And I now give you Mr. Jim Ryder.
Hello. I apologize for that.
No
network
problem.
Yeah, I learned about the company I was working for when I first started out did a lot of motion control for visual effects for television commercials. So I was like, this is pretty cool, because it was sort of a interesting blend of using technology at the time to do creative and fun things that looked cool. And I kind of immersed myself in that world and did that for a few years in New York, and then decided to move out west and stake my claim and as a motion control operator. So, and then, about a year after I moved to Los Angeles, I worked for a company called Image G that did all of the motion control, model, and miniature photography for the Star Trek television programs at the time. And I did that.
Can you tell people a little bit about what motion control is? Because I bet some of our younger listeners won't even know what that means.
Yeah, it's actually having a bit of a resurgence lately in the last few years, having done a big dip for a while. But basically, motion control is essentially it's a robotically controlled camera crane or any variation on, it could be a robotically controlled camera dolly, but typically it would be a camera on the end of an arm that the whole operation could move up and down a track. So if you've ever seen a camera crane, imagine a motorized computer programmable version of that. And the point of doing that is that you can program in a camera move, and then that move can be replicated over and over again, which at the time that was pretty critical to doing a lot of visual effects at the time. This is, not to date myself, but this was before things were still shot on film. There was no camera tracking. So if you be in two things, draft and registration, that were going to be you needed to shoot them with motion control. So on both of them. And a really simple example I still use today is, I want to do a camera move, a dolly shot down the street and I want to make it look like there's two so, I do one pass of the shot where you're on the left side of the frame, and then I run the camera move again, and now you're on the right side of the frame. We do a split screen down the middle and composite them, and now you're having a conversation with yourself. But in terms of using it for miniatures, it was, again, this is pre-CG for models, for anything that would be done CG now. So if you're doing a spaceship flying through space, you would rather than fly the spaceship through the stage, you would move the camera around the model. So you'd have the model here, and you do a camera move that would, make it, and on camera would make it look like the ship was flying towards you or doing some choreographed move that you would have programmed. And if you see a movie like, Return of the Jedi with, hundreds of spaceships flying around, they were all shot individually, they were all composited together, and they all are shot using the same camera moves so that they all live within the same 3D space. But it was interesting. It was fun work. And I could talk for an hour about how you shoot spaceships, but I don't want to take the whole time doing that. But it was really, very interesting. And then it had still a lot of applications for a variety of things, like, certain speed effects and time effects that you would do. And just about the time I had been doing motion control for a number of years, and did it for a bunch of features and then you mentioned the big one that I worked on for almost a year was Titanic. I did all of the I photographed all of the dry for wet, which they called it. If people have heard the term day for night, that's shooting in the daytime and making it look like it's nighttime. Well, we had a stage that was about the size of a basketball court that was completely tinted in absolute, so it could be absolutely dark, but also it was tinted in to hold in the atmosphere, and we shot dry for wet. So when you watch Titanic, the entire sequence at the beginning of the movie when the submarines are exploring the wreck, well, that wreck is a 30-foot long miniature of the wreck of the Titanic hanging from the ceiling of the stage, and the submarines are little robotically controlled submarines that are, exploring it. And I think we go back and forth between into that undersea modern wreck world a number of times throughout the movie, yeah, that was a big one. And Rob Legato was the visual effects supervisor on that. I'm sure you and a lot of your viewers know him. He's a legend.
Yeah.
So
pleasure of working with him a couple of times.
Yeah, and then shortly after that, and actually just one side note on that, there was also a 45-foot long model of the entire Titanic that was constructed because, and I do believe that this was Rob's call, that the feeling at the time was this ship is one of the stars of the movie and it needs to look really good. And I think the feeling was that doing a completely CG ship in those days was not quite there yet. So there were a lot of talented model makers that worked for months building this enormous model of the Titanic. But shortly after those days, that's really when CG started to come in, and I saw that a lot of the, for instance, work that we were doing on Star Trek. By the time we got to doing Star Trek Voyager, we did some of the stuff in the first season with models, but then it was replaced by them deciding to do it using CG. So I decided it was time to get into some other skill sets at that time. And I was already familiar with shooting all of these different passes of, matte passes and lighting passes and key light passes and fill passes to shoot these miniatures, and shooting all of these different passes that would be composited together later. So I knew something about the process, so I got into doing compositing. So my first introduction to compositing was on a discrete logic Inferno system, which was sort of the father of Flame, which at the time an Inferno was an Onyx, well, very expensive, but it was an Onyx 2, which was about the size of a dishwasher, sitting on top of a bank of hard drives, which was also about the size of a dishwasher, and all of that just so you could get real-time 4K playback. That's what was required at the time. And then that led into sort of a short period of overlap where I was doing both motion control, operating Mark Roberts' motion control Milo for a few years. By this time, I'd moved back to the East Coast, and that's about the time I think you mentioned it, right around the Requiem for a Dream days, because at that time I was working with for a small visual effects company on the East Coast, and one of our clients was Requiem for a Dream, and so I both shot motion control for that movie. So those funky time-lapse scenes of Ellen Burstyn walking down the street while she's sort of shot at one frame rate and everybody else is zipping around her. She's all hopped up on amphetamines, and she's hyperspeed cleaning her apartment. So I did those things, and then there was also a bunch of compositing that I did for that show on Inferno, and then after that, I moved into then a whole bunch of flame work as doing a lot of night shift freelance flame work, and eventually got hired as a flame artist at a company called Rhino Effects in New York, which later became Gravity. And Rhino Effects had been around for many years, and they installed a flame suite. So I did a lot of work with, working on commercials with clients in the room. At that time, flame was sort of the clients are in the room with you, and we want to do compositing and creative work like in real time on the fly. And so flame was the system to do that on at the time. So
place to be, and that, a very nice couch next to it.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of pastries and charcuterie behind me, while clients would spend all day in the suite with you, working on a Mercedes commercial or whatever, and then we usually there'd be another shift that would come in at night and kind of finish up what you did during the daytime, and then the client would come back the next day and you finish the spot in a few days. So that also taught you how to, taught me at least, how to work with a bit of a time focus and pressure. You sort of needed to know how to do things. You didn't want to say with a client in the room, like, I'm not sure how to do that. Let me get the manual out. So you wanted to make sure you knew what you were doing, just to save your own stress level,
Right. Yeah, and how to manage your stress level, right? Like, you get into stressful situations, you got to know how to manage your state first, so that you can then give that to them.
Oh, absolutely, and not never let him see you sweat, kind of thing. I do remember a few times where you'd be like, "Excuse me, I'm just going to grab a glass of water," and you'd go out in the hallway. And, okay, yeah, I got this, and then go back in the room. Yeah. Exactly. At the time, actually, the flame manual was 2 volumes, about that thick. So it was the size of, like, I was just going to say, it was the size of 2 phone books, but then I realized a lot of people wouldn't know what a phone book is. Actually, I see a message in the chat from have you worked with Alex Fernbach or Don Canfield? Indeed, I have. I know them both very well. I worked with Alex Fernbach, was a tabletop director, and still is, he's still around, who had a studio in Hoboken, New Jersey, that shot a lot of tabletop. For those who don't know, tabletop is usually smaller scale film productions, usually shot on a small set, about the size of a tabletop, typically, for product shots and things like that. And also, go back to motion control for a second. This was another use case for motion control. Camera moves that would be impossible or extremely difficult to do manually. So ultra close-up macro photography with camera moves would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do manually and have it be steady and pull focus. So all of that needs to be like programmed. And so I did a lot of work with Alex Fernbach doing a lot of tabletop stuff. And Don Canfield is a long-time motion control veteran and wizard. We did a lot of stuff together over the years. In fact, going back to when I started doing motion control. So both of those guys. Yeah. Where were we? Oh, flame work. But you go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
No, it's great. It's great stuff. I think it's really interesting to hear about how this stuff began. I got into visual effects slightly after that, but still in flame suites, that kind of world is very familiar to me, and always the best place to go sleep. Or if I had to stay at the studio overnight, it was always the flame suite that I was looking.
And also, it was although the flame was digital, it was, when I was doing it, it was still for film work. It was still very much hybrid, because you'd be dealing with content that was still shot on film. So we'd have to scan the film as, in 4K, get it into flame, do all the compositing work, and then export it, and then reprint it onto film
again. Yeah.
Print it back onto film. And that was a whole process of making sure that you could just round trip that and actually have it look the same. Just technically, that was problematic. And then when everything went 100% digital, it was, well, this is just in terms of the throughput became much easier.
Right. You could stay in the same environment. You didn't have to go through 13 different formats. But what would you say was some of the benefits? I know earlier you mentioned how some of the motion control has come full circle, and I definitely want to ask a bit about that specifically, because I think I know what you're talking about there. But what were some of the benefits of having gone through like all of the old school methodologies that were fiddly and tedious, and but what were some of the benefits of having gone through that, and some of the things that you would say maybe you don't get from just jumping straight into digital these days?
Well, I don't know, a certain amount of preparation and discipline, I guess, for lack of a better word. You know, when I was shooting, motion control stuff, it was kind of, film camera mentality. Like, you're shooting it and you don't know that you've got it until next day when the film has been processed. So you'd better make sure that you've checked all the boxes and that you're buttoned up and organized. And when you're shooting motion control, the whole point is that it needs to repeat itself exactly every time, and there's a lot of calibration, sort of meticulous setup, at least there was at the time, to make sure that this thing is going to do exactly the same thing every time. In fact, a lot of the mindset of what I'm doing now with virtual production, and just thinking about 3D space and being on set and calibrating a world for 3D that's going to be used both, in a computer, but also that same world exists behind me. And by the way, this isn't really here. It's a photograph, but this is our stage. But thinking about the setup and calibration of a 3D world and just how it all needs to work together, and various translations of all that, it was a good foundation having come out of motion control to sort of learn how to think about things that way. And and in terms of, you were asking about motion control now, I would say the biggest thing I've seen in the last 5 or 10 years is I mentioned briefly the company Mark Roberts Motion Control. Well, they've been making motion control camera systems for, 25, 30 years. Forgive me if I'm stating that number wrong, anybody that knows more than I do. But they also, in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe, came out with high-speed robots, like the Bolt, which is capable of doing like frighteningly fast moves. And what's great is if you want to do a nice leisurely camera move around a bottle of soda that's spraying, into the air, and you want to get that beautiful high-speed photography while you're doing a camera move, well, in real time, that action probably takes less than a second of, a spray of water, but yet you need but you want to do this nice slow camera move. So in real time, you need a camera system that's capable of doing a move like that really fast, and the Bolt can do that. So it's for that kind of high-speed cinematography with camera moves that motion control's made a big comeback. There's a fellow right here in New York, Steve Geralt, who is the master of all of that work, and it's sort of a throwback to, well, if you want to shoot a can of beer shooting up into the air while you're doing a camera move around it, well, you need to build a rig to do that. And there's people like Steve are kind of back to doing those sorts of custom rigs that need to be built and designed and machined to do specific things that are just for that shoot. And that's very much what we were doing, the kind of stuff we were doing, like when I started out,
Right.
like I remember. Yeah. So a lot of that's kind of come full circle.
The robots are back.
Robots are back in a big way.
Are they mad or happy?
Yeah. No, I think they're happy. Although the bolt could kill you if you got in its way.
Yeah. You gotta keep your distance. Use control. Don't let anyone get near it.
Exactly.
What? Because it's interesting talking about that, because that's pointing at going back towards filming things for real, as opposed to what else you could do there if you couldn't get that. If you can't make something in reality, or it's really hard, that tends towards CG and being able to simulate something, do it in Houdini or whatever, and simulate that kind of effect as opposed to filming it. But I know maybe there's a sort of interesting conversation, let's call it, out there at the moment about doing things for real versus doing them in CG. Sometimes people even kind of claiming things that weren't done in CG and were done for real when they weren't. But what are your? I'm not going to name any names, but there is definitely an interesting conversation around that. And I know, being in CG for a long time myself, I always wanted to just get something done the best way that it could. And being a CG guy, I would always tend towards the CG, but always try and push people to do things for real if it made more sense. There's no point in doing something just for the sake of it in CG. What are your thoughts on some of this kind of? Are you seeing more things trying to be done for real as opposed to doing it all in CG?
Well, I have. I definitely have thoughts about that. Because after the whole period that I was talking about, and when I was doing like flame work, and then I got into comp supervision, and then that led into being a visual effects supervisor at various facilities. So, and then ultimately freelance and working on the show side for various shows. So, in a sense, I got to weigh in heavily on how we were going to do something and what we were going to build and what we were going to shoot practically. And you sort of get a sense of, all visual effects is like a magic trick. It's a combination of different techniques that are used across in a sequence. There might be multiple techniques used across multiple shots that are a combination of real and CG, or either entirely practical or entirely CG, or both those elements composited together, that are all, in a sense, distracting you enough from and serving to keep you in the story so that you don't bother to think of how it was done. But if you pick it apart, you'll see that, a lot of just about every sequence is a combination of techniques. I always thought, like 90s era, like James Cameron movies were fantastic at that, because they would be this combination of, and I don't know if you look at like old reference, but like Terminator 2, and look at the action sequences and that on a shot by shot basis and see how each of them were done. They're constantly going back and forth between, different methods. And the idea is just to create a whole across the whole sequence that, keeps you locked in, and so you don't think about too much of how it's done. I think, an entirely CG sequence sometimes can look that way and can still look that way. So I always look for opportunities to be like, well, what can we do and shoot it practically? And if we can shoot it practically and it's feasible, then I don't know. I did a film a few years ago, Fahrenheit 451, which was for HBO, and that had obviously a lot of fire in it. So I wanted to make sure, and yes, we can do a lot of excellent fire sims and all of that, but we also shot a lot of burning stuff. to use to put in so that we could put in real fire and composite in, elements of real things burning. And honestly, a lot of times it's easier, you know what you're getting. But again, it was a combination approach.
And nothing does reality quite like reality itself. Although I keep feeling like we've kind of got to the top, but then new movies come out and push the bar. Fortunate being on a couple of them, seeing some of the advances through The Jungle Book and Lion King were pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Then watching Avatar 2 and just for one of the first times in my career going, I don't know now. I don't know what's.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Stop trying.
And I always wonder though, every time you think that, I always think, well, if you watch that movie in 10 years, are you still going to feel the same way? And then
right.
I'm always surprised at how often I will go back and watch something. I'm like, wow, I thought that looked fantastic when I saw it. But so your eye gets more and more attuned as the years go on.
It's true. Yeah, you have kind of a certain level of expectation or just relative perception built into it. It's amazing how much if you want to make something look real and you're generating it entirely from scratch, how much effort goes into that, how much detail you have to reproduce, how you're trying to reproduce every molecule of what you see in front of you at some point.
Well, and I have, reality is complicated. I have a lot of thoughts about that too. I've had artists working for me, and I'd always say get references of what this thing actually looks like, learn about lighting in the real world, learn about photography, because ultimately this needs to look like it was photographed with the same cameras that shot the rest of the movie. So if you don't have an understanding of how the rest of that movie was lit and shot, or understand, camera motion and all of that, then you'll get close, but you're not going to quite get there, because reality, like you said, is complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I talk about this in the school a lot, and when people and one of the first questions I asked when I got into visual effects, so my first mentors, was people keep talking about photoreal. What does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, how about for you? What does it mean to you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it means that it was created in a way that nobody's going to know. People will think it was photographed, but it's photoreal within the context of what you're trying to put it into. It can look photoreal under certain circumstance, but then when you cut it into the sequence, it's like, well, now it doesn't match because something's off. So it needs to be photoreal within the context of what you're trying to put it in.
Right. As photoreal or as photo unreal as fits to the thing that you're making.
Yeah. We're just yammering on here. By the way, I thought I was going to ask you if this was the podcast where I had to eat progressively hotter chicken wings
Did you bring the wings?
No.
I got the hot sauce over here.
Yeah. We can keep talking, but one of the things I want to make sure we touch on is why I do this, because you talk about visual effects in terms of a post-production process and creating things after the fact that are going to augment what you've shot practically. And that's one of the things that really attracted me to virtual production, which is it is still absolutely under the, I think, under the umbrella of visual effects, except that if we're doing it right, we're getting it in camera. And that's what really got me excited about it, but I'm sort of jumping to the end now. But
no, let's do it. I mean, it's an important part of today's workflow. It's definitely gets a lot of conversation around it, and a lot of people are doing it. So what attracted you to, you just kind of said, I guess, a little bit, but were there any particular kind of experiences or projects that made you think, oh, I want to go for this now?
Well, I started to, I had been doing like show side visual effects supervision for a variety of shows for like HBO and Apple, and it was sort of standard. It seemed like standard visual effects workflow. Like I knew how to do what we were shooting, knew how sort of how to get the information we needed to get on set, data wrangling and all of that, and had the process of like, okay, now we need to 3D track that shot, and we're going to need to make a model of that, whatever it is, to do this set extension, and then we're going to composite it, and then we're going to output. We're going to have the client review it, and we're going to get our notes back. It's like I sort of was very familiar with that workflow. Not that there weren't constantly innovations, but just in terms of an overall workflow, I'd been doing that for a while, and then I sort of got wind of what was happening with real-time rendering and virtual production, and I was like, oh, what's this about? And I started to dive into it, and I was like, well, this is pretty cool stuff. Just for because as much as I love filmmaking and film and storytelling, and I've always been attracted to stories where there is a story to tell, and the visual effects is a supporting component of that. As much as I love thinking about it that way, there's also a big geek factor, and I just love to nerd out on new stuff. And I was like, oh, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I can really get into. And it totally opened up a door of just learning about all sorts of new technology that was just exciting to me, with how it all worked together, and that people were still figuring out how to make it work together, and that it felt like it was new. Now you could argue, which is true, it's like the foundations of what we're doing now was laid, when they were doing, the first Avatar, if not before, in terms of, camera tracking and virtual camera moves and all of that. But as far as it trickling down a bit further down the food chain, there's still quite a bit of stuff that people are still figuring out. And I wanted to be a part of that. And I was thinking, hey, if I could use what I've learned so far about production and visual effects workflows and combine it with the relatively new knowledge of virtual production, that I could do this and have something to bring to the party. And I always tell this anecdote of, I've worked on many shows where, particularly episodic things, where there'll be the last day of shooting, and there's a lot of pats on the back on set of like, that's a wrap. It's great working with you. See you on the next one. And I'm thinking, I still have 3-4 months of work to do on this show, because we now have to put all the stuff together that we've been shooting. I'm not going anywhere. And the idea of working in a way that we could shoot and get things in camera and walk away at the end of the day with the shot in the can, as it were, I thought that was really exciting. And I think
you can actually go home.
You can actually, it's like, well, when the show is wrapped, you're actually wrapped. Now, we're still, as a business, as an industry, aspiring to that reality. It often doesn't work that way, really, yet. There's a lot of, I could spend the whole hour on talking about, virtual production adoption as one of the big issues, and all of the things that are involved in getting people to adopt it. Some of those are financial, some of those are schedule, some of those are technical, some of those are aesthetic. But once I saw it done and done well, I thought, well, this is, I still feel like it's the future. It will not be the way that all, moving images are created, certainly, but it will be more and more the way, more and more images will be created using it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have, because, I was sort of going down this one road and I sort of steered the ship of my career over to this, and I wouldn't have done that if I didn't believe in it.
Right. Yeah, me too. I'm right there with you. I think it was Jungle Book that was the first opportunity I had to go try an experimental way of making a movie, and almost all my visual effects friends at the time weren't interested. They didn't think that it was necessarily going to take off, and that's one example of it, I guess. So speaking of virtual production, that was a fancy previs essentially, but using real cameras and virtual camera tracking. And then now we're here we are talking about LED walls and being able to capture everything in camera, and all of those techniques being used still, all of them. I think it's interesting when people jump in and when a new technology or a new advance happens, people tend, it seems, to say this is the way that everything's going to be done. It's like, it's very black and white a lot of the time. It's like, all right, yeah, VR's here. Okay, we're going to do everything in VR now. All movies will be made in VR. Everything's going to be done in VR. And it's not the case with that. And it's, as you're saying, probably not the case with virtual production. It doesn't mean that those things are not tremendously useful and have tons of value, but
absolutely,
they're tools, right?
Yeah. It's also worth a shout out, by the way, of how did I get into this? As I started to explore it, I heard about the Epic Games Virtual Production Fellowship, and I did that a few years ago, and learned about all things Unreal Engine and did a deep dive into that, and then I was worked for Epic briefly as a for the fellowship program, and the community of all of those people. Like I feel like we probably crossed paths through those channels as well, as how we knew each other. But I still am in touch with this huge community of people that sort of came out of that program, and it's very exciting because there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that's been figured out, but there's a lot of stuff where you're like, surely somebody must know how to do this. And you ask around and it's like, well, I've never done that yet. And you're like, oh, well, how would you, there's a lot of sharing of ideas still. And that's, it's just tremendously exciting. I feel like I've, learned more in the last 5 years than I had learned in the previous 10. Just in terms of, there's a constant tidal wave of new information that comes out about this entire field that's, a lot of fun to follow.
Right. Yeah. And I think, to your point, just unpicking what you said for a second, that your conversation about your enjoyment of what you were doing in visual effects sounds like you were potentially kind of just getting used to that, and you were looking for something new, and here comes this thing, and this provided you with an opportunity to learn new things, to be excited about growing and learning new things. The only time I've ever thought of leaving computer graphics in the middle of the career was when I stopped growing, and I've since thought about that a lot. Thought about how much of a parallel how much of a connection there is to your own passion. Between your growth and your passion, like how excited you are relative to how much you're kind of pushing yourself.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you're somebody in the fellowship always used to say, always learning, always learning. Like no matter what, you could have been doing Unreal Engine for, for 12 years and be an expert, and then somebody's going to show you something that you still didn't know how to do. I didn't know you could do that. And there's a lot of talk of Unreal Engine because when we're doing fully 3D virtual production, that's what we use for the real-time rendering. But even beyond the game engine, there's so much about just how all of this technically functions, and that's been a lot of fun to learn about. My goal now would be to use this. I feel like the projects that like film and television projects, which is kind of that was always my passion, are still not completely adopting this and I think that there's a lot of it, but there could be a lot more. And I think a lot of it is just holding on to old ways of doing things, when it's like, well, if you were to just like all of these half-page location shoots that are in the script where we do these big company moves and go to location, or an example I always use, which is not the most exciting example, is when they finish a show with a standing set, they'll put a big padlock on the stage door and leave it sitting there paying rent on the stage in case they have to go back and do pickups. It's like, well, just scan the entire set and then we can shoot anything virtual production later if you want. It's funny, I did that and my thumb went up. There's a whole bunch of applications that I see it being used where people aren't quite thinking about it. An example I always use is when a producer is, even before a project is going, is looking at a script and how it's going to be executed, and they're breaking it down just on the back of an envelope. They'll say like, okay, well, this is going to be a standing set because we're in it all the time. These are too specialized, and they're one-offs. We'll do these as locations. This will be green screen driving work because we don't want to do practical driving. But what they're not currently thinking is, this could be, we'll do a week of virtual production at the end of the schedule. We could hit this scene. Like, I don't know that people are quite thinking that way, like as a go-to tool. It still is kind of a specialized thing that if you're not shooting something that's, sci-fi adventure action type film, is not as much on the table as it could be, or that I know it will be in the next few years. You know who's really into it? The people who were all over virtual production are the people that are learning about it in school and are getting out of school. I know a bunch of people they've shot their student films, virtual production, and they're like good to go. It's people who have been used to doing things a certain way where it's harder to change that mindset.
Right. Yeah, people get very used to doing things the way they do them. And it's interesting that you said one of the reasons for adoption. I know that there's others where some of the technology is still maturing and we're trying to adopt it at the same time as it's being invented. And that's tricky. But
yes.
On the other side, what you mentioned there is important in terms of people doing things differently, and inherently humans don't like change. It's uncomfortable to all of us, and asking somebody to change is tricky. I'm wondering if, because you've watched the progression from analog film, if you like, to digital, if there's any parallels you see here because I know there was a lot of resistance to digital, moving from analog and practical effects to digital effects. I know there was a lot of resistance to that. Is there any parallels here?
Yes, very much so. Early digital compositing, didn't always look as good as it could have, as if it had been composited optically. But it was embraced because it was less expensive at the time. But then a few, pioneer sort of productions would have taken it on, and then it only got better. I remember shooting a lot of car commercials. Again, going back to shooting things with motion control, doing a lot of car commercials, and what people would say at the time is, well, they're always going to shoot cars for real. They're never going to do CG cars because the car manufacturers are too precious about how their cars look, and they're going to want those cars to be real. They'll always shoot real cars. Well, that's completely not the case now. And yeah. And so, and same thing with this. It's like the rendering's only going to get better. The panels are only going to get better. The lighting's only going to get better. And so it's maybe not as big a change as the change from film to digital, because that was across the board industry wide, and now it's the odd outlier that is still shooting film. And I love film, but it's just digital's the way to it's the way to go nowadays. Yeah. It's the way to do it now. And so that's across the board, across all productions, no matter what you're doing, is the change from film to digital. I don't see, every production utilizing virtual production, but virtual production is a big umbrella also. There's technologies and techniques that are tangential to ICVFX virtual production that I think will be used more and more, whether it's, much more sophisticated previses with virtual cameras. And I think that there's, resistance, or not resistance, but just a lack of familiarity with doing that. And I think a lot of creatives think, oh, well, it's going to be a burden somehow, like to adopt this. It's like, well, no, that we can now do it so that it is, hand a virtual camera to your DP, and it's like, show me the camera move you want to do. You get to do the previs. I feel like, that'll get adopted, more across the board or even, production designers using Unreal Engine for pre-visualizations of their sets and all of that. There'll be more and more of that as well.
Yeah, huge benefits to being able to see what you're doing before you spend all the money on making it. What can you tell us a little bit about what you're up to now?
Sure. A little bit about my virtual production journey. A couple of years ago, I was a virtual production supervisor for a company called Final Pixel, and did some good work with them. Great bunch of people there, and then I left them August before last, and again, I was sort of figuring out like, oh, well, I would really love to stay in the virtual production world. And then fortunately, end of last year, I heard about Pier 59 Studios, who had built the largest virtual production volume in New York City. And they needed a virtual production supervisor to essentially, keep it running and work with the clients. And so I'm lucky to have found a place where where I can keep doing this, because there aren't that many of these, and so right now I'm the virtual production supervisor at Pier 59 Studios. So, come on by.
I look forward to it. What kind of stuff are you guys focusing on at the moment?
Pier 59 Studios is mainly focused on the commercial production. I think we're certainly open to, and again, I'd be happy if they wanted to do more long form film, television, but sort of a different client base. And if I wanted to work in virtual production, this was the place to do it. And I'm, happy to ply my craft for whatever clients want to shoot here. But I think there's a lot of possibility of, like I say, more film and TV work coming here as well. I think a lot of people just don't know about it.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons we exist as a school is trying to help fill the skill gap, as you mentioned, with schools and people adopting it. Certainly a lot happening in the colleges and schools around the US and internationally. And sometimes maybe it takes a generation or half a generation to be willing to not have the baggage of the way that we used to do things and bring through the new stuff.
No, and I'm happy to be doing this.
Great. Yeah, it's definitely a lot of evolution going on in it. I think there's plenty of growth for us all for years to come. I'd love to ask, just before we wrap, about any appearance of some of the machine learning or those kind of tools starting to appear in workflows.
The technology is amazing and fascinating. I have issues with, some of the copyright ramifications of it, which that's a bigger discussion. But I do see, it getting better and better and being used for something like this, or doesn't have to be virtual production, but I still think it's a bit in the very impressive but still nascent phase. Very often you'll see something which it's like, okay, well, that's pretty cool. That's gotten me 85 to 90% there, but getting a shot done and having it be perfect is about getting it 100% there. So I don't think we're quite there yet. But it's definitely, it gets asked about all the time. And it's also heavily misunderstood. Like, can't you just AI that background, that environment? Can't you just do that now? It's like, well, not quite yet, So it's going to continue to develop. It'll get adopted more and more. But like a lot of, AI tools. I've used AI tools in Nuke and again, some of them they'll get you a good 85% there, but then you still need an artist to go in there. So I don't think artists who have an eye, a human eye, are going anywhere.
I agree. And I think it's interesting to talk about on the after the wave of obviously controversy, and not to ignore the moral debate, but the fear component of it, where everybody started to talk about in visual effects and in production about all our jobs are going to be gone and the robots will be doing everything and the director's just going to speak 4 sentences into a text box and then the movie pops out the other end.
Yeah, but that's not, and even if that were possible, that's not creation though.
No,
so
it's right. It's not a desirable process to do that. And I think that's where a lot of the misunderstanding comes in, that the creative process is the thing that actually births the movie. You don't go into a movie knowing exactly what you want. You make it, you create it along the way.
And it needs to be created from an original concept, an original design, an original aesthetic that nobody's done before. That's what makes it unique. And currently AI is all based on stuff that's been done before. So because that's how it functions.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, and really even calling it AI is a missing the mark. It's is neural nets, machine learning. The machine learning gives it away because the machine has to learn first to be able to do something. And it's
fascinating, but it's not something we're currently using for in any way, shape, or form to. We've used it for some mood boards and things like that.
Right.
but not actual content, But the whole AI thing, we could spend another hour on that. So.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I won't, don't worry. Or maybe we get to have you back sometime. We can continue.
I'd be happy to. Yeah.
That would be great. Yeah, I'd love to. I appreciate being able to talk about it because I think it's important to myth bust that area and just ask professionals who are actually doing this stuff, what are you actually using? And is this really there? Because I think a lot of people think it's there a lot more than it is.
No, we still have artists building things.
You have real humans. You might have a Sisu in there and a couple of inspirational images, but otherwise it's all people.
Yeah, exactly. So,
well, Jim, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. Before we close out, do you have anything that you want to share with folks? Any places they can follow you, see your work?
I mean, our website, Pier 59 Studios, if you want to learn a bit more about Pier 59 Studios. And, I'm not huge on social media. So if you want to reach out to me, you can ping me on LinkedIn, which is sort of, 90% of what I do on my social media. I have an Instagram, but I don't use it much. So, but I'm always happy to hear from people. And there you go.
Great. Well, thank you for offering that to the community. Thank you for everything you're doing in the community. I love being able to hang out with you in this form and hopefully soon in real life again.
Yes, we'll have a pint.
I look forward to it. Well, yeah, thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure having you on today.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
You bet. And thank you also to our studio audience. Thanks for coming in and asking questions. If I didn't get to any of them at the end there, I apologize, but do ask them in the background, either to us or, as Jim said, get in touch with him if you want to ask any more details. I know people were asking a couple of things about producers and the role of producers and a little bit more depth into using Chat GPT to make tools. Yep, that's a thing. Mm-hmm. People are doing that to help with code assisting and image assisting much more in the pre-production phase in terms of imagery and certainly making tools.
I know, I have seen some, I'm like, well, that is pretty cool. Like, write me a blueprint to do this. It's like, oh, wow, that actually worked. So yeah, that's interesting.
I feel like with all of it, with all of that automation, that a little bit like the question earlier about what people miss today by not having to go in the darkroom and process their own code. Like, it's great not having to do that, but having had to do that takes you through a process. You get to really learn about the constituent parts of making images, and you have to focus on things more, learn the fundamentals. That's something I would say to people with all of this kind of prompty immediate stuff is go spend all your time learning the fundamentals. Still, as an artist, you should train your eye, learn the foundational skills. All the tech skills are going to keep changing, but if I was to learn anything today, it would be more in the fundamentals of computer science and the fundamentals of art.
I 100% agree. Get a camera and learn about lighting and shoot things yourself, and it will make you a better artist and a better lighter and a better texture artist across the board if you learn how the real world looks.
How the real world works, exactly. Yeah. That's the job of the artist, right? You observe the world, figure it out, and then if you're really daring, then like some of the great painters of history, like Dali or Picasso, look at their later stuff and it's wacky and trippy, but you go earlier in their work and it's stunningly photoreal and very matter of fact. They had to go through that phase, learn the skills and learn the rules before you break them.
100%.
But yeah, be in touch. Thank you to our audience. Thanks for asking those questions. If there's more questions you want to ask, keep in contact with the school, CG Pro. As I said, you're welcome to open days. There's plenty of things that we do, and probably some links out there have gone out there in the chat. If you're watching this live, if you haven't, find us at becomecgpro.com. Go and have a chat with Mr. Jim Ryder, and hope to see you all again on our next episode in a couple of weeks.
All right,
guys. Thank you, Jim.
Bye. Thanks again. Bye-bye.